when folks here at Upper House were trying to craft the sort of the promotional materials for this event, we were all trying to come up with what are the words we use to describe Parker. And the words we came up with, you may have seen them on some of the promotions, were founder and senior partner emeritus of the Center for Courage and Renewal, world-renowned writer, author of 9 books and another on the way, speaker, and activist. We could have also added that he holds, I don't know, either 11 or 13 honorary doctorates, depending on which site you look at. We could call him a sociologist, since he has an actual Ph.D. in that field from the University of California at Berkeley, so we call him Dr. Palmer. We could call him a community organizer and a teacher, because he's done that in his life. We could have said he has revolutionized the way many teachers at all levels now think about their work. We could have added the word visionary, since the Utne Reader named him in 2011 as one of the 25 people who are changing our world. We could have called him baffled, because the bumper sticker he's always wanted would simply say, "Born Baffled." Some of you may be familiar with his work with Krista Tippett on Being on the website. He writes a weekly piece for that site and is frequently on her program. We could call him a Quaker, a spiritual guide, a lover of poetry. We surely could call him a loving father and grandfather and husband to Sharon. Sharon's with us, his granddaughter's with us tonight. So you can see why we had to narrow the list for the promotions a bit. That's just too much to say about anybody. But we may discover some other words as we're talking here tonight. It is great to have you with us. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Phil. It's great to be with you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
I'd like to start with, we often start these conversations with kind of where the roots are in how you think about the world, how you think about your spiritual life. I know you wanted to go back to your grandfather coming over on the boat, but maybe we could start a little later than that in your life.
I checked with Phil earlier. I won't go back to the covered wagon. He said that would be too far. Well, when I think about the root system of my life, I think the first person that comes to mind is my father. He was a businessman in Chicago. I grew up in a Chicago suburb called Wilmette, which some of you will know. Dad arrived in Chicago during the Depression with a high school diploma in hand, and 55 years later he was owner and chairman of the board of this company that sold chinaware and silverware. One of the self-made people of that generation. I was the first person in my family to go to college, but my dad gave me an education in generosity. He was known in Chicago as not only an extraordinarily ethical business person, but as a person with a big heart and a generous spirit. One of my most vivid memories of my dad was that he was constantly hiring people who weren't the best and the brightest, but he felt he could teach them what they needed to know to start to realize their dreams and give them the same gift that this country had given him, which was that leg up, as it were. And to grow up with that was huge, especially in a community like Wilmette, which was very enamored of its affluence and of its self-importance, an all-white community. It's an important part of my biography that I did not truly get to know a person of color as a real human being until I went to Union Theological Seminary at age 22 and found myself working with junior high kids from Spanish Harlem under the tutelage of a remarkable youth pastor, an African-American man named Bob Moss. And so the journey really starts with my dad. It goes then through struggling to come out of some of the parochialism of Wilmette, Illinois, by spending that year at Union Seminary.
Can I just back you up a second? Because
Sure.
You've written about when you were in high school, your dreams were you were going to be a naval aviator.
Yes.
And then you were going to go into advertising. And
yes.
you don't usually go to Union Theological Seminary for those dreams?
No. Well, now you're touching on heartbreak. You're right. I never got to fly. I never got to advertise. Clearly there was some faith in your family. There was some kind of religious tradition in your family that you came out of that got you interested. Yeah, exactly. I grew up in the Methodist Church, and I have to say that Sunday mornings in the big congregation didn't particularly speak to my teenage soul, but there was a youth group there that really formed my sense of what community was all about. A wonderful, wonderful youth minister named Bert Randall, who never wanted to be anything other than a youth minister. And he had a way of creating the kingdom of God in a community of kids who at New Trier High School, this big 2,000-person high school, were very stratified. You know, there was a definite pecking order. There was a caste system. But on weekends, under Bert Randall's ministry, we were all one. And I loved that. I learned so much from it. And I think I carried that image of community into adulthood. And it's part of what, took me to Union Seminary, thinking maybe I wanted to be a minister too. But as I like to say, God spoke to me in the middle of that year and said, I really don't want you messing with my church. That may have had something to do with getting a D in the Hebrew Bible, which was just too long for me. I mean, it was just too much material. And so at that point, I went to Berkeley to do a Ph.D. in the sociology of religion. I mean, I was at seminary partly because the field I ultimately wanted to study did have a religious dimension to it. And for those of you who know the sociology of religion at all, I lucked out in drawing Robert Bella as my dissertation supervisor, who was a wonderful man. But before that, I was at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota, town of cows, colleges, and contentment. And I lucked out there because I had three mentors who in some ways were like my dad, but they added to that generosity of spirit and that largeness of self. They added this intellectual dimension. And what strikes me about all of them, David Maitland, the chaplain, Ian Barber, who was in both physics and religion, and did some of the great breakthrough writing in religion and science, and Bardwell Smith in Southeast Asian religions. All three of them found no warfare between science and religion. They were very smart people. They knew their stuff. They were scholars of the first order. But one of the things that I'm baffled about is what this alleged warfare between science and religion is all about. I just don't get that, because I had the good luck to be formed by very well-educated people who simply understood how to hold a fruitful paradox in a way that opened minds and hearts to larger truths and realities than you can see through one eye alone. It was like they had stereoscopic vision, not tunnel vision. So that was very formative, and I took that to Union, and I took that to Berkeley. Berkeley was a big piece of my education, my formation. I was there during the 60s, and the impact...
Were there things going on in Berkeley during the 60s?
There were, yeah.
I need not to move, because when I lean forward,
That's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard not to move. So, yeah, there was some stuff going on at Berkeley in the 60s. And its impact on me from Wilmette, Illinois, and Northfield, Minnesota, was a much keener and three-dimensional sense of the larger world and of the largeness of community, of the vitality of diversity, and hope and social change. I think a lot of the people I went to Berkeley with, but when we hadn't changed the world by the end of the 60s, they bailed out. They went to Wall Street. I remained a believer, and I think it was because I had a lot of nurturing from experienced activists at the time. So when I got my PhD at the end of the 60s, cities were burning, my heroes had been assassinated, and I decided that academia was not the life for me, so I went to Washington, D.C. and became a community organizer. That was a fascinating 5-year period of my life. I was pretty thin-skinned. You get beat up a lot as a community organizer. I started reaching at that time for an inner life that would sustain me, because up until that point, I think, religion for me was pretty much in my head and in a belief system, but not in a spiritual life that was rooted in the word become flesh, really, in some sort of human grounding. I remember it was during my time as a community organizer that I discovered Thomas Merton. And I never learned anything about anybody like Thomas Merton growing up in a sort of slightly left of center Methodist church, right? That whole mystical stream was unknown to me. And it was a total accident. I was in a used bookstore one day looking for a book by Thomas Mann called The Magic Mountain. It wasn't there, but in the slot where it should have been was Thomas Merton, The 7-Story Mountain. And I thought,
pretty close.
Okay, 2 books about mountains, 2 surnames that begin with M. I might as well pick this one up.
And for those who aren't familiar, Thomas Merton was a Trappist monk who wrote during the 50s and 60s and really helped shape a lot of spirituality in our country.
Yeah, thank you. Hugely so. And was a kind of saint of the activist left, you know, the anti-war movement, the racial reconciliation and justice movement. Even though he was tucked away in a monastery in the wooded hills of Kentucky, he was read and he corresponded with many of the key actors in those great social movements. So like millions of people, I got captivated by Merton's autobiography, The 7-Story Mountain. And that set me off on the effort to bring together the concerns I had about the external world and finding ways to be fruitfully engaged with it, especially around questions of justice and positive social change, but without ever losing that inner grounding without which that external stuff isn't sustainable or fruitful or well-guided. Without which you can't really know your calling. So, you know, I don't know when it was, 20 years ago, a long time after the period I'm describing, I came up with this notion of life on the Mobius strip. Some of you know the Mobius strip, where it's this very remarkable shape where it's a three-dimensional shape, but it has only one side. Because what looks like the inside keeps flowing into the outside, and what looks like the outside keeps flowing into the inside. And when I saw that, I thought, that's what life looks like. The inner and the outer keep co-creating each other. And so in some ways, my spiritual life for a long time has been around the question, can I be so attentive to every moment of inner-outer exchange? You know, where I'm making choices about what I put out into the world, and then I'm figuring out how to internalize whatever the world throws back at me, choices that are on balance more life-giving than death-dealing.
How do you do that? When you're looking at a day, a week, a month, an opportunity in your life, is there a process you go through to sort of do that inner-outer?
You know, I think it's a big word these days, obviously, but I think it's about mindfulness or thoughtfulness or awareness or consciousness. I'll give you a very immediate example. I'm 78 years old. I've done a lot of stuff like this, sitting in front of audiences talking about my life talking about challenging questions. And still at age 78, there's that piece that was there at 28. There's some fear in me, around question of, am I making any sense to anybody? Am I getting any decent points across? Am I doing service to these ideas or stories that I'm trying to tell? And how do I look while I'm doing it? This self-awareness thing. This, do they like me? Right? That's part of our external lives. So I have choices to make about what it is that in a setting like this, what it is that I bring from within me in that great schlemazel of stuff. Schlemazel is a Yiddish word that I made up, so which is quite a trick for a Quaker goy, but I did. I have a number of Jewish friends who actually think it's Yiddish, but they go and look it up and it isn't. So there's this churning mix of stuff. Do I move toward you with that anxiety about how it's going, or do I move toward you with my confidence that these are things we all care about and want to explore together, and in a while we'll have a chance to do that in dialogue with each other, which is the part I always like best. I can be more or less conscious of that. And if I'm less conscious of that, I'm more likely to come forward with the lesser angels of my nature, right? We talk about Lincoln and his better angels of our nature. We often forget that by implication, he fully understood that we have lesser angels in there too. And in this culture, in this society, and in these times, we have a million ways of loosing the lesser angels and letting them fly. So I have questions to ask of myself. Sometimes if it's a huge audience and I don't have a chance for interaction, I thought a lot when I was younger about why is it that you're so fearful, so paralyzed with fear? And I realized, it's because you think it's showtime. And the questions you're asking yourself are, am I putting on a good enough show? But that's not why you're there. You're there to serve people. You're there to serve ideas. You're there to serve purposes and values and needs. And if you can stay focused on that, you're going to be in a whole different mind and spirit set in front of 5,000 MDs, which is a situation in which I have indeed found myself more than once with the two big screens, up here. One of my proudest moments was when I got up in front of those 5,000 MDs down in Orlando, Florida, and they had those two huge screens, and I looked, before I said a word, I looked up here and I looked up there, and I said to 5,000 doctors, I'm feeling a little beside myself. If I hadn't, right, you understand, if I hadn't been loose enough to say that, the talk wouldn't have gotten off to a good start, and I wouldn't have felt immediately at home, because there's nothing to make you feel at home more than people laughing with you, which is another great gift my father gave me. We laughed a lot in our house. We just laughed all the time, not at each other, but with each other. Laughing at people in my house was a no-no, but laughing with each other was a requirement. And
You mentioned towards the end of the 60s that sort of sense of discouragement that a lot of your classmates were feeling, that they hadn't yet changed the world. I think that recurs every year.
Right.
So how have you, over your years, dealt with discouragement, disappointment? I know depression has been a part of your life. How have you dealt with those bumps in the road so that you can move forward and not get stuck?
Right. 3 deep dives into clinical depression, which I've written and talked about, because, again, I think it's a service to not be ashamed of that or to not tuck it away, and to speak in a way that may bring comfort to somebody that you don't even know is suffering, or walking with someone who is suffering. But we can talk about that more later if you'd like. So I have a big thing around what I call framing and reframing your life. And I think a lot depends, with a question like, how do you keep from being discouraged? A lot depends on how you frame or reframe the situation that you're in that's discouraging you. So around the question of not accomplishing, not saving the world by the end of the 60s or the end of the 70s or 80s or 90s, or God knows the end of this decade. And God does know that, believe me, and she's watching every moment. So I have this uplifting notion called learning how to stand and act in the tragic gap, right? And I just came back from doing a 3-day retreat for young leaders and activists out in California, where this is one of the key concepts that I try to work with these young people with, because they're doing heavy lifting in this society, and they get discouraged. Who doesn't? And so this notion is that we live forever in a tragic gap, which is defined by, on the one hand, the harsh realities around us, which we can read about every day and experience every day, and on the other hand, what we know to be possible, not because it's a wish dream or a fantasy, but because we've seen it with our own eyes. And I could give you 1,000 examples of both, but just very quickly, we know there's a lot of greed on this side of the tragic gap, and we know over here that people are capable of remarkable acts of generosity and of sharing, and of each one teach one, or from those who have the most to those who have the least. So the question becomes, how do I stand and act in that tragic gap without flipping out on one side or the other? To flip out on the side of too much reality is to flip into what I think is what I call corrosive cynicism. It's like, oh, I see how this deal works, so I'm just going to go out and hustle the biggest piece of the pie that I can get and let the devil take the hindmost. On the other side, you flip out into what I call irrelevant idealism. You're floating above the fray. Wouldn't it be nice if we could all just get along, you know? And corrosive idealism and corrosive cynicism and irrelevant idealism sound like opposites, but they really aren't, because they both function in exactly the same way, which is to take you out of the tragic gap where the action is. And it's tragic not just because it's sad, but it's tragic in the sense that the Greeks talked about, the biblical literature talks about, Shakespeare talked about. It's tragic because it's an inherent flaw in the nature of reality and in the nature of ourselves. It will never go away. The gap will never close. And so, like with these young activists, a few days ago, I was saying, think of someone that you revere because they devoted their entire lives to values like love, truth, and justice. So whether that person is famous or known only to you, hold that person in your mind. Now ask yourself the question, was that person able to die, or will he or she be able to die? Thinking, I'm sure glad I devoted my life to that, because now everyone on the planet can check that job off their to-do list forever, right? And of course, no one has ever been able to die that way. Question is, what sustains you when you fail, as you always will in these things, you fail this society's highest definition of worthiness, which is to be effective and get measurable results. But when you fall short of that, and that standard has us in a death grip in this society, be effective, get measurable results. When you fall short of that, how do you sustain yourself? There's got to be an answer, because people have devoted their lives brilliantly and courageously to things with which they weren't effective and didn't get measurable results. Jesus might be an example, just for example. But so are a lot of contemporary figures. And here's the thing, if we don't have an answer to that question, if there isn't a standard that supersedes effectiveness, you and I can predict exactly what will happen because it happens all the time. We will take on smaller and smaller tasks because they're the only ones you can be effective with. get results with. I give you education. We are no longer, in this society, interested in educating children. We're only interested in getting them to pass tests, because that's a small task on which you can get results, you can teach to the test, you can remove from the curriculum all the non-testable subjects, you can even cheat on the tests by having the grown-ups go back to school after dark and change the kids' answers, right? And that's happened, all of that has happened all around the country. So if we don't have an answer to the question, what supersedes effectiveness, we're going to keep taking on smaller and smaller tasks, and our society and ourselves are going to be greatly diminished, as we are already in the process of becoming in some areas, big time. I think the word that works for me as what supersedes effectiveness is the word faithfulness. And by that I mean faithful to my own gifts, faithful to my awareness of the needs that are within my reach, and faithfulness to those places where my gifts might intersect those needs. I think at age 78, I think that on the day that I check out, I mean, I'll let you know after it happens whether I was right about this. I'll send an email or something. I mean, I'm sure there's a .heaven that by now. If I can say to myself in that moment, yes, to the best of my limited, finite, fallible ability, I was faithful to my sense of my gifts and the needs and where they intersected with reasonable frequency. I think I can check out with a sense of satisfaction, even though all the love, truth, and justice jobs that I cared about remain to be done and always will remain to be done. I work with a lot of secular audiences, and if you heard that as a way of translating a Christian message or a biblical message, you heard it right. But it's the language that I use to build bridges instead of walls in trying to talk about the things I care about.
You've got a bunch of books, several of which we have here on sale tonight. There's the commercial entry. One of my favorites was what has been your most recent, Healing the Heart of Democracy. And in here, one of the things you talk about is, to some sense, it's a piece of that tragic gap, that we think we've solved this problem. We've now taken care of, let's say, civil rights.
Right.
And so we move on to the next problem, and all of a sudden, it changes. And it doesn't matter whether you're liberal or conservative, you think you've solved this issue, the country has come to agree with you, and all of a sudden, it changes. And part of what I understand your call in there is, that's why we all need to stay engaged, because these issues are never settled. They're public issues.
Right.
And then you talk about, we can't just take it for granted that we can ignore the public life and settle into our own private space and have all be well. And I'm just, in this era when we're really struggling with how do we talk to each other across these divides, that's a lot of what you were writing about in here. A couple of thoughts you might be able to share with us.
Well, it's a big question, right?
Yeah,
and
we've got a couple of hours. We've got a few more minutes.
Well, I wrote a book about it, but it's a great question. It's a very important question. So, in 2011, my wife and I went on the annual civil rights pilgrimage led by Representative John Lewis on the anniversary of Bloody Sunday. One of the most remarkable experiences of our lives. And knowing John Lewis, following him through that 3-day sequence of events from Birmingham to Montgomery to Selma, and then following him back across the Edmund Pettus Bridge when he was about 74 instead of 24. And hearing his stories and the stories of folks who've known him a lot better than I about his fidelity, even up to this very day, when parts of what had been achieved back then have been destroyed, dismantled, undermined. he's an inspiration to me. And once you meet somebody like that, you realize this is possible for real human beings in real space and time. In coming more directly to your question, conceptually, I guess the thing I'd most want to say is this, which I say in the book. It amazes me that when we talk about politics in this society, we almost always talk about them, about those people in Washington, D.C. or in the state capitals who are usually screwing everything up, although sometimes we throw kudos rather than brickbats. But we spend a lot of time with our friends and families and neighbors and even in church discussion groups talking about them. And I like to ask people, so when was the last time in your family or your neighborhood or your friendship group that talking about people who aren't in the room ever solved anything? We need to talk with each other a lot more than we do, not so much about them. Because I'm convinced that there is a unity in the American people and a capacity for goodwill in the American people and a resilience in the American people and just a common sense in the American people that is not present in what institutionalized politics does to human beings. And okay, I will grant you that 20% of the people on the left and 20% of the people on the right will never fit the description I just offered, right, of common sense, rationality, goodwill, et cetera. That they're just not there right now. But that leaves 60% with whom you can still have hope of doing business. And in a democracy, that's more than enough. One of the things that I don't like about our political discourse is we keep talking as if we have to get everybody on board. And we don't. The last piece of research I read on the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century said that less than 5% of the American people were in any way actively engaged with that movement. And yet look at how it changed the lay and the law of the land. It's the law of critical mass, right? And that can be even 5%. So what I think is that we need a million small groupings of people who are trying to reach across these lines that now divide us. And people who understand that it's more important to be in right relationship than it is to be right. Mm-hmm. We have to stop looking for ideological conformity in our conversation partners. And what we have to do is to forge those strong containers for conversation that will allow us to carry forward with difficult issues. I'm not giving up on the notion that there are facts and there are lies. There's right and there's wrong. I'll never give up on that. But those are often complicated matters. And if you can't forge a strong container, a right relationship for exploring them, we'll never sort them out. Healthcare is actually complicated. You know, that came to as no surprise to me. I'm really trying to restrain myself here. That came as no surprise to me at all. And so having conversations, for me, as somebody who wants universal single-payer health care, and asking a physician friend or two, so why are you so against Obamacare? And hearing them talk about the amount of paperwork required, which keeps them up till 2 in the morning, keeps them away from their families, and wears them down for the next day's attempt to pay attention to patients, that makes a human impact when you hear the micro story of how policy impacts human lives. But without a strong container, you never get there. And if you start, the other thing I work on, as you know, Phil, in the book, is if you start by throwing our ideological positions at each other, rather than saying, what's your story? What's the life story that brings you to this position you hold or this belief that you hold? We'll never get anywhere. But start with the life story, and we start to weave a fabric of resilience that's called civil society, and that's eventually called democracy. I think the thing that bugs me most about this is that, is it not clear that some very expert people have, for many years, been playing the divide and conquer game, which is the oldest political game in the books, or one of them, and we have been falling for it hook, line, and sinker. And that certainly includes me and my progressive pals. Yeah. We have been among, the primary agents of division in this society. Why are we such suckers that we would fall for a tactic that allows, okay, I'll use a non-Quaker word, the enemy, to achieve their goal? We have to wake up about all that.
Let me ask you about somebody who I think spent part of his lifetime working on that, and I'm bringing this up, Howard Thurman, who you've been a contributor to a book that's about to come out about his life. Howard Thurman was a theologian, African-American pastor, whose writings really influenced Martin Luther King. And Upper House will be doing a conference on the life and work of Howard Thurman at the end of April next year. But you spent some time looking at his work and going back to that person who really affected you, Thomas Merton. And can you I've got one more question after this, and then we're going to throw it out to the crowd.
Yeah, great.
But can you just say a little bit about the role, what Howard Thurman might have to say to the American public?
I'm excited that you guys are doing something as we are trying to do with this book. A group of us, mostly African-American scholars, who have written chapters about the impact of Howard Thurman's work on our lives. I never met the man, just like I never met Merton, but he's one of those people that you sort of travel with because the written word, makes you feel like you know him. He, she, whoever it may be, sort of lives within you. And Thurman, so Martin Luther King Jr. carried with him two books. One was the Bible, and the other was Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited. That's how seriously he took Thurman. Many people at the time accused Thurman of not being actively engaged enough as an African American in the civil rights movement. But like Thomas Merton, he was one of those backstage people constantly nourishing the root system of the movement. Howard, there's so many ways in which Thurman's thought has impacted me, but one of his most famous statements is one that, as a Quaker, resonates with me very deeply and started feeding me even before I knew that Quakerism was about more than their wonderful, delicious oatmeal. And that's the statement in which he encourages us to listen for the sound of the genuine in ourselves and in each other. And he says, if we can't get still enough to hear the sound of the genuine in ourselves, and if we can't get still enough with another to hear the sound of the genuine in them, we won't get anywhere with anything. And I think one of the things we desperately need to do in this high decibel society of ours is to dial down the noise when we're alone and together and listen for that, which, as you read Thurman, you get more and more clues as to what that might be. So there's so much to be said about Howard Thurman. That will be said at a conference, I think, here next year.
Yep, end of April.
And I'm hoping that some of my colleagues in the writing of this book will be present at that. And I believe that Luther Smith from Candler School of Theology, who was a close friend of Dr. Thurman's, will be one of those people. It'll be a wonderful exploration of the work of a really great man.
So we started off with your early life, and I think you said you were, I don't know, 48? Is that what you are now? 40? Or something in that.
Right now, you mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I started very young.
So as you're in your 70th year, I know the next book you're writing about is how you're seeing the world afresh.
Yeah.
You're on the brink of everything.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking about that. So this is my 10th book, and it's about aging. And as I told my editor the other day, it took me 10 books, but I finally found a subject that I know something about. So keep trying, young people. You'll find it. So the book is called On the Brink of Everything: Grace, Gravity, and Getting Old. I had no interest in writing a book about growing old gracefully, because I have no idea how to do that. I really think old is just another word for nothing left to lose. And
That could be a good song.
well, it could, yeah. Something about Bobby McGee, I don't know. And I really think if you're able, if you're blessed with the health to do it, old age is a time for risk-taking on behalf of things that maybe you weren't ready to take risks for when you were in your 40s. I just want to say a few words about where I got the title, On the Brink of Everything, which is a title I love. So those of you who follow the On Being site will know that there are several regular columnists who have weekly columns. I'm one. A wonderful Muslim chaplain named Omid Safi at Duke is another. And this remarkable young writer named Courtney Martin, who's a very dear friend of mine, half my age, lives out in the Bay Area, is yet another. And a year and a half ago, roughly, I woke up early one winter morning and read an essay that Courtney had written about her then 16-month-old daughter, Maya. And she was writing about Maya discovering the world as only a 16-month-old child can do, you know, just being wide-eyed and wonder-filled at everything. And Courtney used this wonderful line in the first paragraph of the essay: Maya is on the brink of everything. Well, that morning, just before I read her essay, I was looking out the east-facing window of our upstairs bathroom, which was, you know how it gets in Wisconsin, glazed with ice, and the sunrise was coming through it. It looked like a rose window at Chartres Cathedral. And I stood there just mesmerized by this for several minutes. And when I read On the Brink of Everything, I thought, that's where I am too, at age 78. There was a day not too many years ago when I would have been so busy, so compelled to just get to work, to start writing, which I usually start doing at 5 in the morning, that I wouldn't have even noticed the beauty of that sun coming through that glaze of ice. And so the next week, I wrote an essay called On the Brink of Everything, which was about the experience of growing old. And among other things, I touched on where we go when we die, which incidentally, and this is going to be a big selling point of the book, because it's an answer to a question people have asked for ages. We're all going to the boundary waters of northern Minnesota, which is heaven on earth as far as I'm concerned. So you know, jot that one down and see you there. It was a wonderful, fun essay to write, and it just planted the seed in me of a book that expand that into book length after asking Courtney permission to steal her line. And so the book is turns of the prism through a series of essays that are divided into 7 sections. And the sections include such things as, like, you know, the view from the brink, and then reaching out to the younger generation, which to me is a big piece of vitality in one's older years. I write about a life in writing and how important it is to, as life goes along, to figure out the difference between your job and your vocation, because your job may end, but your vocation doesn't have to ever end, as long as you can, as long as you have the good mental and physical health to, and or physical health to pursue that vocation,
Yeah.
which people do in a whole variety of ways. I mean, some people have a vocation to prayer, right? And that can go on for a very long time. And then keep reaching out, keep reaching in, and then the final section, where we go when we die. So I'm having great fun putting it together. It's going to be out next May, and the manuscript is due December 15th, so I probably ought to be getting home pretty soon.
But before you leave, we want to give you all some time to ask some questions. But I was concerned because you were talking kind of mid-talk about, the sort of anxiety that comes with speaking in front of a crowd, and you want to know, am I making any sense? Was he making any sense tonight? Can we give him some reassurance? So I think John and Melissa are going to be on with microphones, and we've got about 25 minutes or so for questions. So what would you like to ask Parker? And I'm going to kind of see right.
Thanks, Phil. Dr. Palmer, I saw you here a few years ago, a lot of optimism when you were talking about your more recent book, now the little further back, Healing the Heart of Democracy. We seem to be moving in the wrong direction. How are you viewing the practices that, the perspective you were pointing to in that book, now that there's, just a greater divide and, and really less democracy in this country?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I share the concern of a lot of people that structural damage is being done to our democracy that's going to be very hard to repair. Especially, I wrote an article for On Being in March of 2016, well before the election, called "Will Fascism Trump Democracy?" And I do think that I wrote in that article about elements of fascism. I think the time has come to use that word without declaring a full-out fascist state. But there are classic elements of fascism at work in our body politic right now. The effort to discredit the press is one of the leading examples of that. Divide and conquer, creating hostile online and in public environments for people to express dissent. I've often said that I think the founders of this country created a system in which, for the first time in history, conflict was regarded not as the enemy of a good social order, but as the engine of a better social order. And they gave us institutions that were meant to harness the energy of conflict to help create that more perfect union. Fascism kills off the dissenter, either literally or figuratively. And I talk about that these days because I still believe in the capacity of the American people well, forgive me, but I'll quote another American president, Harry Truman, who said, "The American people are capable of distinguishing chicken shit from chicken salad." And, I still believe that common sense is out there, but some of us have to name it. I'm just quoting Harry Truman. So, as I said, I think a lot depends on the level of rhetoric at which we're speaking. So if all the rhetoric is dominated by the Kellyanne Conways and their bosses, and is trumpeted through the kind of media that has no interest in anything except selling something that's salacious or scandalous or highly abusive and abrasive. If we allow all of the discourse to be at that level, we're sunk. But if we insist in all of the local venues of life, and here I go back to Alexis de Tocqueville, as I do in the book, because I still think those ideas are worth a lot and operative. We go back to those local venues, the family, the neighborhood, the congregation, the voluntary association, the workplace, the school, the classroom, and can liberate more and more of those spaces for these kinds of conversations across lines that create strong containers rather than encourage people, spaces that encourage people to be in right relationship rather than simply to be right. And that requires some skillful facilitation, but it can be done. I've seen it done a lot. Then I think we have more than a fighting chance. And historically, things often have to go down before they can come back up. Don't it always seem to be that you don't know what you've got till you've darn near lost it, is a pretty good rule of how history moves along. And I think there's a growing awareness in this country that we are on the edge of losing something. I also want to say, I began this book with a prelude that I'm still very glad I wrote, in which I said what was being called the politics of rage, that some people are still saying that's what led to the current presidency, the politics of rage. I said in the prelude, I think that's a shallow diagnosis. I think it's the politics of the brokenhearted, the politics of the brokenhearted. And my whole purpose in this book was to reframe certain political dynamics from the traditional and I think rather desiccated language of political science into the language of the human heart, where we can actually feel it and feel it with each other and explore it with each other as a set of human relationships in which some people suffer. There's a lot of suffering going on. One of the other things I argue in this book, and I'm trying to compact a lot in one answer to a big question, violence is what happens when we don't know what else to do with our suffering. I'll say that again. Violence is what happens when we don't know what else to do with our suffering. So there are a lot of people in this country, not 50%, because he didn't get 50% of the votes. He didn't even get the plurality of the votes. But there's a lot of people in this country who've suffered a lot and who now say, I don't care what he does as long as he destroys stuff, right? They say that, literally, They say as long as he's tearing the government apart and tearing down reputations, of people like John McCain. There are a number of reasons why I disagree with John McCain, but to tear down the reputation of a man who has served his country the way McCain did, as long as he's tearing stuff down, I'm all for him. Because violence is what you either do or aid and abet when you don't know what else to do with your suffering. May I suggest that Christian faith and the other great world religions more or less began in an effort to answer the question, what's something else we can do with our suffering? The church I was raised in, anyway, said that the whole Jesus story is about redemptive suffering, suffering that doesn't lead to violence, but the kind of suffering that we can actually see at work in people we know who have lost the most important person in their lives to death. They suffer, they go underground, they grieve, they think life will never be worth living again. And yet in many cases, they slowly emerge to an awareness that not in spite of the loss, but because of the loss, they've become larger hearted. They've become bigger in spirit. They've become more forgiving. They've become more generous. They've become bigger people, right? I'm not blowing smoke here. I'm saying I've seen it and you've seen it hundreds and thousands of times. Suffering that is redemptive in that it breaks hearts open rather than apart. And I think that that can happen in politics too, if we understand that this is not rage we're dealing with, but brokenheartedness.
Ruby Sales, who was a teenager during the Civil Rights Movement and whose life was saved when someone took a bullet for her, says a good place to begin these conversations with people is, where's your pain?
Yeah, exactly.